Okay, good morning, folks. You're very welcome to this week's Let's Talk Dairy. This morning we're joined by Joseph Dunphy from the Grass10 team to give us a bit of an update on the grass situation around the country in drying conditions this time, Joe. Previously when we had you on, it seemed to be getting wetter and wetter every week, but it's the opposite now. And then we're being joined then by Donal Patton, Teagasc researcher in Ballyhaise, to give us an update on the Ballyhaise Clover trial. So I suppose, Joe, without further ado, what's happening out there? How is the thing looking? There's a lot of talk in the media in terms of the do's and the don'ts at the minute on farms. I suppose give us a quick update in terms of where it's at.
Thanks, James, and look, good morning to all your listeners, Joe. So I suppose, like, after another week of hazy sunshine, high temperatures, and serious breeze in points too, like an awful lot of drying on farms. Like, it has soil moisture deficits have bumped up a good bit in the country, and I know, and growth rate has dropped back on farms. If we look at the figures there from the week from pasture based, farm cover is about 730 at the minute, cover per livestock unit 198, and growth about 65. But I tend to really not focus too much on the average, James, in that point of view, because there's some farms in parts of the country that are beginning to struggle big time, and then there's other people who are just getting by at the minute. The growth rates are holding up, probably a couple, 3 or 4 paddocks on the top of the wedge holding that growth rate okay, but it's maybe further down the wedge that there is issues. If we have a quick look at the soil moisture deficits, they're probably approaching 65 mil, 70 mil in certain points of Carlow, Kildare, that sort of area, Kilkenny, probably the southwest probably about 55, the west Midlands maybe somewhere 45 or 50, so getting away a little bit there. But I suppose the figure would be really around 60, 65 before we begin to see a considerable drop off in growth rates, and there is certain counties that are approaching that at the minute. So I suppose, look at, James, briefly from a management point of view, probably the most important thing is establish a growth rate for the farm at the minute. Where is it? Keep an eye on it, and I suppose getting ahead of that, then you can start talking about the options, the feed options that are available there, for you in the yard. From a key point of view on the rotation length, try and kind of set that rotation length somewhere between 20 and 25 days. On the farm, don't let it spiral down the way. If pre-grazing yields are dropping and average farm cover is dropping, hold it there to the 25 days. If we can keep 180 to 220 per cow there on the farm, that'll be important, which would keep maybe somewhere between 700 and 800 on the average farm cover. Dry matters are very high at the minute. They were above 20. So, in general, I know quality is dropping, but cows in general are fed. So, they should be full enough there at the minute. I suppose, from a feed point of view, depends on what you have in the yard there, James, just for a few options. If you've got some good quality bales and growth rates are dropping, you probably can get away with maybe 3-4 kilos a meal and throw in a couple of good quality bales at the barrier there for a start. If you don't have the high quality bales there straight away, James, it could be a question of going that little bit further on meal and bringing in some poor quality silage, more first cut, bulky sort of silage. And then if there is a shortage of silage, which there is in some yards around the place, James, you're probably looking at other high fiber options, your hulls, your beet pulp, and in certain cases some palm kernel.
Yep. Very, very good, Joe. One question actually that has come in there with regards, is there a certain level of forage that we need to keep in the diet, I suppose, just to keep cows right? Because I understand where silage is restricted, possibly, but there has to be a certain level, Joe, I suppose, that needs to stay in the diet.
Yeah, and look, we'll try and keep maybe somewhere in around 13 kilos, 12, 13 kilos of forage if we can at all. And I suppose, look, at when we get to maybe some of the extremes of the drought, you'll be talking about maybe 6, 6, and 6, but it'll be, to try and keep that somewhere that keep that room and right with that level of forage in it.
Yep. Okay. Come here. Quick question too. Fertilizer. What's the recommendations on that? Because I suppose a lot of people are wondering that situation at the moment. Depending on growth and how your farm's performing, I suppose, Joe, does it?
Yeah, like again, it's not a simple one either, because there's huge variation around the country. But like in general, if there is cover on the farm and the farm is growing, there's some heavier paddocks growing, there is a decent dew at night, I would be on certain paddocks on certain farms. It's no harm to continue with 10 or 15 units. Okay, it's not like maybe say 2018. Later on in the year, that in general that fertilizer should be safe enough there in the soil. So even if it's not used up there immediately, and have that maybe that 10 or 15 units out, and maybe on a proportion 30-40% of the farm, something like that, have that fertilized there in case we get some of the rain that is potentially there over the weekend. And maybe some soil water again. We learned from 2018 soil water, or that extremely light dilute slurry, what's in the collecting yard tank, worked very well on some paddocks, some drier paddocks on the farm. So maybe no harm to forward spread, maybe ahead of the cows in advance of that rain, 10 or maybe 15 units, and use your soil water, maybe something that's grazed.
Okay, yeah. I suppose the big thing there, Joe, is that there isn't reapplication of fertilizer where growth rates are really dropping off, because that's the one that's going to possibly do harm.
And there probably is some farms that are just they know themselves they're too dry in those particular dry areas, and if they don't get it over the weekend, they're too dry. But there may be farms southwest and the west, that are still growing okay at the minute and can make use of it.
We appreciate that, Joe. We'll have yourselves on next week, and the Grass10 team may do a rain dance this week, I think, for the vast majority of farms, to make sure everyone gets a little drop along the way. Come here, thanks, Joe, as always. Very informative.
Talk to you later, gents.
Thanks a million. So yeah, as I said earlier, folks, we have Donal Patton, Teagasc researcher from Ballyhaise. A lot of our viewers obviously would know you, Donal. There's a relatively new trial, and I say that in the fact I think you're actually in the third season, or definitely the third season, in terms of actually establishing Clover on the farm. Maybe just explain a little bit. I suppose what we want to go through today is a little bit about the overview of the trial, but ultimately then I suppose an update on how it's actually going.
Yeah, so look, I suppose, James, we're in the third year. We started in 21 with this current trial looking at Clover. So I suppose if you wind the clock back to sort of 2020, I'd be fair to say we were behind the curve in terms of Clover. Up to that point, we really had done very little in terms of trying to establish it on the farm. Whereas we'll say the farms in Moore Park, Clan, Ballyhaise were sort of showing great results from Clover. So I suppose it was the next thing we had. At that stage, we had 15 years probably of grass growth data sort of showing that the farm was capable of growing 14 tonne, which are 250 kilos of N. But looking forward, that nitrogen application is probably going to become under pressure. So we sort of said, right, well, Clover is the next thing we need to look at and figure out. So in 2020, our steering group came together in August, and we sort of put together a proposal for them, what we wanted to do, which was convert the farm into Clover, or a portion of the farm. So as I said, we were behind the curve in terms of, at that stage, there was pretty much 0% with any significant level of Clover in the swards, and we kind of decided to use that as a positive rather than a negative, in that what we wanted to do was look at the transition process. So instead of, we'll say, comparing directly cows on grass versus grass Clover, starting from a clean start, we said we'd look at the transition phase from grass swards to Clover swards.
That's important, Donal, in the fact that I suppose some of this systems trials ultimately, as you said, the cows would be coming in and they'd be going on 100% grass Clover swards. Really, I suppose this is the first of its kind in the fact, in terms of actually transitioning a farm, no different than a commercial farmer would do. Now we'll come to that in a moment. Maybe you possibly did it a little bit faster rate. but to track that process and actually see how that's going. So I remember that steering committee meeting, and some of the people involved had tried Clover and possibly had failed along the way, Donal, and were further north, heavier soils, drumlin type land. The real question there was establishment, and can it be established was kind of the first question. And how did that go as such, I suppose? A couple of methods and how have you actually got on to date?
Yeah, well, sure, look at it. I suppose initially when we were starting out, James, we were sort of intending to approach it like you would on a commercial farm, which was maybe slow and steady. And I know talking to commercial farmers, that's kind of the one message that you're trying to get out there is do an area and try and do it right rather than trying to do a big area at one time. Our steering group at the time said, look, that's fine on a commercial farm, but for ye, we want to get the answers as quick as possible. So like you mentioned the answer, or the big question being establishment. I think even a bigger question was persistence. A lot of the farmers, there was a couple of guys there that day actually from Donegal who would be in close contact with a few organic guys up there, and they would have said persistence of the clover and the heavier soils is an issue. So I suppose that's why we decided to speed up the process. But from an establishment point of view, I suppose, look, we went the full reseeding route, but on top of that, we looked at oversowing as well. From initially, that was from the point of view of speeding up the process. So the reseeding has its strengths and its weaknesses, and the oversowing has its strengths and its weaknesses. I suppose with the reseeding, to break it down or to summarize it, the reseeding, if you take the percentage of success with the reseeding, it has been much higher. Better swards, more productive swards. But the problem is that you're taking the land out. And I know we talk about the 6-week turnaround, but I'd say the reality over the last 3 years with the ground we've taken out is more like 8 weeks, and this year it could be 10 weeks just with the way things went. So I suppose that's from a systems point of view, that's going to have a knock-on effect, and has had a knock-on effect in year 1 and 2 and will this year as well. So the oversown was seen as a way, look, we can leave the ground in, we can graze the ground, and we can try and establish it over, but not as high a success rate at all. Some of it worked quite well, and then some of it was a complete failure. And I think talking to commercial farmers around the country, that's fairly common.
And come here, in terms of any facts for us, clover percentages on the reseeds maybe versus oversown paddocks, where would you see them at maybe for 2022? Yeah,
well, our 2021 paddocks, if we sort of use them, so last year was their fully productive year. Yes, exactly. They would have started the year actually quite similar in the mid-teens, which would be good, and declined then. But you could see sort of in the month of June, you could, when we're doing separations, so our percentages are not, it's not a visual assessment, it's actually separating on every paddock and every rotation. So it's accurate, and it's the same methodology used on the other research farms. But look at our clover contents in June in the oversown paddocks versus the reseeded paddocks. There was a divergence. Like the reseeded paddocks sort of took over at that stage, and they would have climbed to an average of around about 60% from August, September, and then drop back, whereas the oversown paddocks were in around the mid-40s. Now that's an average across all the paddocks. So there was some paddocks within them oversown ones that there was a number of paddocks that there was very poor contents on, which would have pulled that average down. But there was more variation, and overall not as good a clover content, but still quite good. Like still you're getting up above 40%. It's still not bad for a first attempt at it. Now the ones we did last year were done later in the year, and they were complete failure altogether. So the 2021 ones, I think it was around about 80% of the area we covered. You could count as a success. Last year it was 0%, and that was just time, and it was done.
That's what I was going to say. Is there anything there? So what you really highlighted so far is ultimately there's no issue in terms of establishment. the methodology reseeding really is much more consistent.
Yeah.
But is there anything for our listeners that you can pinpoint for the oversow and the do's and the don'ts that you've learned? And I suppose all of this, to a certain degree, is you're learning and learn. I heard you say that before. You're learning to a certain amount as you go, Donal.
Yeah. Well, look, I suppose on the oversowing, James, it would be fair to say that, and it's no different than, we'll say, what's coming out of some of the on-farm research stuff. It's the timing, you know what I mean? Like basically April, maybe for us we can get into May in years like this. This was we didn't do any oversowing this year because it was just too wet and then it was too dry, basically, very, very quickly. So I think the timing is the number one thing. On the land like what we're working on, it's probably a bigger runner than it is on the drier soils. So as I say, you have April, kind of May to play with. And look at, in terms of what we did, we just tried to graze them, quickly after, and graze them at low covers, and obviously reduce the nitrogen as well. And look, as I say, we didn't do anything different from that point of view last year. Just the only thing was timing. It was probably done in June, July, because that block of ground needed weed control and we had to wait for the spray. And really, it just really proved the point to me that the timing is the number one thing. If you're thinking about it in June, don't think about it. Leave the seed in the bag till next year. So timing is the big thing.
Okay. In terms of then, I suppose, some of the other questions that would have come up was, right, we established this clover. Is it going to maintain, possibly even increase the level of grass grown on farm? Where or what have you seen in terms of, I suppose, if you look at the last production year, your clover paddocks versus your grass only paddocks?
Yeah, so look at, we have a good, it's not comparing one paddock with another paddock. It's a good range of paddocks across different land types, even within the land block that we have. And we're kind of looking at that when we're comparing. We did the same level of reseeding across all our treatments. So our grass only treatments, we did exactly the same level of reseeding as our grass clover treatments. So that was from the point of view of looking at, as we go down the road, we'll be looking at the same age of swards. We won't be looking at new grass clover swards versus old grass swards. So look at on last year in terms of, as I say, it's early in the game. It's only the 2021 swards were the full first productive year last year. But in terms of tonnage grown and reductions in nitrogen, it was positive. So look at this all has to be statistically analysed, but you're talking about in around 14.5 tons grown. Our grass across both grass and grass clover swards. Our grass swards got 225 kilos of chemical N plus another 25 kilos of organic through slurry. And our grass clover swards got 56, I think it was, kilos of N and another 25 kilos of organic through slurry. So look at a big reduction in N and a similar level of production. And I just pulled off year to date for all our grass. So this would include the 2021 and the ones that were reseeded or oversown as well last year. And we're sort of sitting at, to date, 4.4 ton with 120 kilos of N spread on our grass ones, and about 5 ton with 70 kilos of N spread on our grass clover ones. Now that could change as the year goes on or whatever, but it would have surprised me in that I wouldn't have been used to managing or dealing with the grass clover swards. It would have surprised me their ability to actually keep growing with low levels of nitrogen. But look, I suppose the big test is as I say, the persistence going forward.
Yeah. So you're quite happy that when the clover contents is there, ultimately you're fit to maintain growth rates with, as you say, much lower levels of N. Yes,
but the one thing I would say on that is that it's a bit of a change in mindset, in that there's a tendency you'll see on the clover swards versus the grass swards. 10 days after being grazed, the clover swards can look kind of yellow and hungry, and there is a temptation. I need to spread nitrogen, and it's hard not to. But as we've let it sort of develop and progress on, they do catch up basically in the next number of days until they're ready to graze. So if the clover, as you said there, if the clover content stays, I'd be pretty happy. That I couldn't see why it wouldn't maintain itself. Now, the last autumn, this spring, and the last couple of weeks has been a real test in terms of the clover content. So I was just looking back this time, or in May last year, on average, we were sitting around about just under 20% in terms of clover content across all that area. At the minute, we're sitting, or for May this year, we were sitting at 10. So, and you can see that walking around, it's definitely under pressure. Look at a wet back end, a wet winter, a lot of flooding, and then a wet spring. Well, it was dry in February, but then March, April, and into May it was difficult. And it was just completely flipped and turned on its head, and it's gone hard and dry. So it'll be interesting to see how it responds in the next month to 6 weeks, James, to see does the clover content get back up. And I suppose that's the reason why these things are done over a period of time. So it's a 6-year project, and we sort of said year 1 to 3 is the transition phase, which is where we're in just towards the end of that at the minute. Year 3 to 6 then is sort of the settled phase, where we can look at the persistence and animal performance and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. So as always, folks, you can type in any questions you wish to ask Donal there. But I suppose that really you've highlighted there that maybe some of the other questions that the steering committee would have had at the time really was, right, establishing it, maintaining grass growth, but then that persistency question. And I suppose really over the remainder of this season and probably next season, you're going to answer those questions. From a management perspective, you highlighted it there, high levels of clover and swards last back end. How are you managing that in Ballyhaise? Obviously, there's concerns at commercial farm level, maybe the levels of management required, or what are you doing different than you would be on your grass only swards, I suppose? And have you had any issues?
Yeah, so what are we doing different, I suppose, right? Look, I've said it before, the bloat is the barrier to adoption, really, I think, for this, and that's understandable, I think, at farm level. People are afraid of it, and we'd be nervous of it ourselves because of the fact we didn't have experience of it. And that's not just myself, but the lads that are on the ground more so, picking in and out the cows, and John Joe or Barry that was there last year. It's different than what probably we're all used to, and that takes a bit of adjusting. So I suppose we took the belt and braces approach, James, in that, we can save nitrogen, we can help improve environmental benefits, but if we start losing cows with bloat, people won't adopt it. So we took the belt and braces approach in terms of trying to prevent it. What have we done differently? I suppose the first thing is we went in with bloat oil quite well. We went in from probably 1st of August on, when those contents were getting up over the 50%. We went in at that stage. Some people questioned the benefit of it, and I can understand that in wet weather, the high risk bloat weather, are they drinking enough water or whatever? But look, we are using the dispensers in the trough, and sort of what we said we were going to do was, even though those grass clover, the clover treatments were actually still hopping from grass swards to clover swards, which would be a risk factor. We sort of said that the bloat oil goes in every day. Just keep it in all the time. Like last autumn, we were probably up at sort of 75% of our area that had significant clover, and 25% didn't. So they could be going to a grass sward tonight and clover sward tomorrow. But even when we're on the grass, we kept the bloat oil in. That was the first thing. I suppose the second thing then was the 12-hour wires went up earlier in those treatments. So in general, on average over the years, that sort of tends to happen in around the middle of September. So it's when your pre-grazing yields are getting high and they're getting up into building cover on our grass swards. And generally speaking, that's where, and if grazing conditions are good, you might get away with 24-hour wires or whatever. But on the grass clover treatments, we were probably 3 weeks to a month earlier, which is an extra job to do. But we said, look, if we do that to try and prevent the problem. And then I suppose the main or the big general sort of point was we tried to make sure the cows were full as much as possible, so that they weren't going into these very high contents empty. And in some cases we had to maybe do stuff that we didn't really like doing, which was moving cows on and moving cows back and stuff like that. But the main point was keep the cows full, and you know, don't have them going in empty. And those few things seem to have helped. And then I suppose the last thing we did was look at, so we were sitting at an average of 60%. So there was some paddocks up at 60, 65%, 70%, one paddock up at 70%. Basically what we did is we pulled out those paddocks and we left them till the very end of grazing. And we grazed away, and then when we sort of hit those what we deemed to be very high risk ones, we housed at night and grazed them during the day, which again is not something we like doing. On grass wards we like to keep grazing until we're finished and then house, but on the clover, those high clover contents, that's what we did to try and avoid the problem.
Okay. And you didn't have any issues?
We didn't have any cows like that we had to get vets to or stuff like that, but there was, you know, sometimes you'd see cows that were big coming in out of them. So I suppose it's just something that you have to watch and be mindful of. Yeah.
Very good. Couple of questions in there for you. Couple around nitrogen. So we'll start maybe on what you did, and then we might maybe get a recommendation from yourself at commercial farm level, because I think sometimes they're a little bit different, Donal. With the lower clover content swards this year in May, what rate of chemical N did you apply?
So look at the approach we took on nitrogen was, and there's a good bit of debate around this, but and look at, I suppose the approach we took was we put on chemical N as normal in spring. So that was our 2 applications, you know, your half bag urea in our slurry in February, your full bag urea then in sort of late March, and then on our clover swards we got no more nitrogen for the rest of the year. And
that would have been the process last year.
That would have been the process last year, and then in 2021, well, we wouldn't have had any clover swards starting out, but we wouldn't have had any clover swards starting out, but when we sowed them after got 10 and 20 at sowing, they got no nitrogen after. So that's basically what we did. And on our reseeded swards, I was happy enough with that. I thought that worked well. You know, even in the first year, and you know, I know your white clover doesn't fix for a period of time or whatever, but in our first year after sowing, the swards grew quite well. They grazed out well, you know, the cows were never unhappy going into them or whatever. They were, you know, they grazed out well. On our oversown swards, we tried a similar approach year 1, and it was very difficult. So we tried the approach of pulling the nitrogen completely, and it worked from an establishment point of view, but there was a fair cost to pay in terms of grass quality for that period of time. And the other thing too is, James, look at, I suppose, which we haven't sort of said, but for year 1 and 2, and even this year, we're talking about 20-25% reseeding of your area, and year 1 and 2, another 15-20% of oversowing. So there's a huge percentage of your farm that was either out fully for reseeding. So that 20% oversowing could actually be 40% of your grazing platform when you took the reseeding out, because it was all done around the same time.
And just to comment on that, Donal, I suppose, look at, as you said at the start, that was really to fast track the process to give the listeners answers ultimately, and to give the farming community answers. But that you wouldn't be recommending that, I suppose, as you say, you're probably recommending 10%.
Look at 10% reseeding,
10 and 10 maybe,
is as much as you want to be doing. And I suppose it depends even on your grazing platform stocking rate. If it's on the high side, maybe even that's a push, you know what I mean? So exactly what you said. Look, at the reason we're doing that was to give people answers quickly. We'll record the impacts of that, which basically in that first 3 years transition phase, the impacts is a shortage of silage at a relatively, you know, with a whole farm stocking rate of 2.5 cows to the hectare. We're still, you know, well short of silage in some of them treatments, which commercially is not practical. You couldn't do that. But I suppose our interest is really on how those swards persist. So if we waited for 6 years to get them in, it was going to take us 10 years to answer the questions. Whereas this way, hopefully after year 4 or 5, we'll have a good handle on it.
Yeah, and we'll stay on the nitrogen questions.
Yeah.
With a low percentage clover, so I suppose that
Yes.
I'll ask you from a commercial farm level, right?
Yeah.
With a low percentage clover, would it be recommended to fertilize as normal or reduce to 150 kilos of nitrogen per hectare across the board? So I suppose the real question there is, from that May period on, if clover percentages are low on commercial farms, what would your recommendations be
I
there?
don't have a recommendation because I don't have the experience, and that's not avoiding the question. I'll have a pretty good idea in a couple of months, James, in that we're at 10% now. And look, we've had this debate even among ourselves, sort of, Jesus, some of them are looking saying, should we be putting nitrogen on or should we not? I suppose what we want to find out is the plant's ability or the sward's ability to recover. And we'll have a pretty good handle on that in another couple of months. And I know that's too, people want the answer now to their situation, and that's fair enough. But like from our point of view, we're in the position that we're going to leave the nitrogen off and see what happens, and possibly we'll be regretting that and saying, geez, we're down a ton or a ton and a half in terms of tonnage. And that's the hard bit about the whole.
You'd be fit to say that, though, Donal.
That's the hard bit about the whole thing, really, is that it's a bit of a patience game, and depending on your situation, you know, what farm level, particularly the heavier stock lads, it's quite hard to be patient, really, because you know you have a herd of cows to feed.
I was going to say that ultimately, really, and that's a very good question from the viewers. I think everybody, you need to assess that in terms of what percentage of the milking platform are we talking about? What is your stocking rates like? Because ultimately, as you said, Donal, the cows must be fed first and foremost. I would say there you need to monitor your growth rates as well.
Yes.
I understand just in line, and I don't mean need to be monitored maybe in line with the other paddocks on farm. Obviously, growth rates are slipping at the moment.
Yeah.
But you need to make a decision really at farm level then on that. If it's a small percentage, Donal, as you say, you possibly could.
You could, but
look and see the recovery. Yeah,
one thing I noticed from going out talking to lads at groups and stuff is that when people have one paddock at Clover, they just keep going to it with slurry, which there is nitrogen in slurry, and that's fine. You can do that with one paddock, but you can't do it with the whole, you know, a high percentage, which is the position we're in. So look, we're going to weigh it out, and sometimes, you know, there's only when I sat down and just went through the figures there this morning, you know, in terms of what we've grown and to date and the amount of nitrogen that goes on, it kind of, I think that's what gives you confidence, and not to focus too much on the colour of the sward, because that can lead you down the wrong path, I suppose. But look, if you're looking at swards where there's 5% clover in them, and if you don't know what that is, I suppose go to a group meeting, or there's some of the clover walks being held, I think, in the next wee while.
There is, yeah.
Like if you are looking at swards that's down at, you know, 5% now, the reality is you're going to have to put nitrogen on them back, or unless you're in a situation where you can do without, you know what I mean, if you're in a low stocking rate. But most lads at normal stocking rates will have to put on nitrogen.
Yeah. If you don't have the clover contents, ultimately you have to revert back with nitrogen.
Yeah, it has to be there. If it's not there, it's not going to do its job.
Absolutely. 3 more questions here, and I think unless there's any more, we'll wrap up then. So how do you control weeds after year 2? Maybe just mention what I suppose the importance at reseeding stage, and then what do you intend to do going forward?
It's one thing. So we have 2021 swards that were reseeded, and we have 2021 swards that were oversown, and that's one of the differences in them today. As we sit looking at them today, the reseeded ones are clean. Now there is dock starting to creep in. Like, you know, they would have been spotlessly clean last year. This year you can see, you know, bits and pieces of docks creeping in. The oversown ones, definitely, and we would have had a fairly good job in terms of controlling weeds on the 2021 ones prior to oversown. But there's more docks with them. So Look, I suppose it's one we'd be scratching our head a little bit ourselves. The options are spot spray, which is okay to a certain point. Some people will just have to live with a certain percentage of docks, and then it'll get to a point where it's just going to be a full reseed job. There is products there, as far as I'm aware, but that you can use, but efficacy of them, can be a little bit hit and miss.
Yeah. So it just shows the importance, I suppose, of that post-emergence. If you don't get that right, ultimately that's your one chance really to do a good job for a number of years. Another couple of questions. Just the stocking rate on the clover swards, 2.5, I think you said, across the farm.
It's the same across all treatments. So look, I suppose what we're doing is, and we didn't get into the nitty gritty of the nuts and bolts, I suppose, but we're looking at systems where we're on grass, 250 kilos of nitrogen, and we're making no attempt to establish clover, and we're just going to run it as we've always run it.
Which is your normal, as you say, which you always run it. It was the normal system. Correct.
The only difference between that and we'll say our base system that's been going back 15 years now at this stage is that that there's more reseeding being done to keep the swards the same age as we go through. But everything else is pretty much the same. It's the same. Our clover. What was the question? Sorry, our clover swards.
No. That was it, in fairness, just the stocking rate. So your
stocking rate, the stocking rate was the same, James, across all of them, 2.5. Now, look, as a whole farm stocking rate for us, going back around about 2.5 cows to the hectare, we should be 90%, 85, 90% sufficient for feed. As I've said, in year 1, 2, and probably this year, we're going to be well off the pace in that. But that's just a factor of having so much land out for reseeding.
Yeah. Two other questions. How is clover in a drought? Will it keep growing? Will it keep fixing nitrogen? So
look, I can't really answer the second question, but I can answer the first one. It's growing as well as the grass is, so it's fun. I've never seen as quick a change. Like 3 weeks ago, we're at the point of housing, to be honest with you, and maybe some people would argue we should have been housed, and there was probably nights that conditions were very bad and we did a bit of poaching and whatever. But it has switched now. Now we're still, last week there we were growing up above 100. This week we grew sort of 60, 70, but it has dropped off. Like there's one of our treatments there that's we're actually feeding bales to them to try and hold cover on a very low cover. But overall, when you look at it, the grass clover swards are growing as well as the grass swards in drought. We wouldn't be in proper drought yet, we're still green, but dry conditions. But grass quality as a whole, but I don't see any difference really between the grass clover and the grass quality as a whole. James, is poor now. It's been a big struggle,
which has been a challenge on farms coming out of that wet spell anyway.
Yes, and
dry conditions.
We're sort of saying a stocking rate of 2.5, which is a little bit misleading, because when you take out the level of reseeding that we've done, and this is the same for the last 2 years, the first 3 years, we're sitting at a stocking rate of 3.8 to 4. So we graze everything once, then we close up our reseeding. So from middle of April until that reseeding area comes back in, we're sitting at a stocking rate of 4. Now, what has happened this year is that because of wet weather, we got some of it sprayed and couldn't get it tilled. Then it has turned, and then this week and last week we're sort of saying, will we sow it or won't we? We just went ahead and sowed it, but unless rain comes, we could have a long wait. So that's what I'm saying about the 6-week turnaround. When you're doing a big percentage of your area, actually trying to get it done, and weather windows and all the rest, it hasn't worked out for us in the last 3 years, and it's not just a 1 year thing. Each of them 3 years we've been getting through that amount of reseeding has been a problem. So our stocking rate is high actually for the first half of the year, but when all that ground comes back in, we'll be buried with grass the second half of the year.
It's really no different than at commercial farm level making a decision possibly to close up too much ground for first cut or second cut or whatever it is, and you're pushing yourself. to the limits in terms of the grass quality, and
but grass quality, I suppose,
being fit to fix it, Donal, is the
we're
big
being
thing.
fixed to fix it. So what's happening to us at the minute, and we did get taken surplus out, but and we didn't let stuff build. We took it out pretty quickly, but I don't know off the top of my head, we might have only 20% or 25% of the farm available that has got a blade at this stage, and the stuff that hasn't got a blade, as in hasn't been baled or whatever, is grass quality is a problem. But look, we're just trying to graze our way through it. And
one last question here, and you're going to tell me it must be a Cavan man, but I actually don't think it is. The cost balance between bloat oil and nitrogen, and I suppose I'll add on a little bit to that. Is that where the conversation should be around this?
Look, and I don't know. I understand that obviously for a commercial farmer, first thing in your head is cost, right? And you're looking at this, and you're probably listening to us talking, and I've been accused of a bit negative about it. I'm not being negative at all, but you have to be realistic about it as well. We've had lots of groups. Look, we had an open day last year, and we've had loads of groups in since. I don't know many groups. We've lots of groups in, and this is the conversation that comes up with people, and I think it's a fair conversation. So look at the bloat oil. When we worked it back, it cost us €30 a cow, James. That's where it was at. Okay. Now that's counting the oil from that point of the year through, and dispensers and all the rest of it. That's where the cost was. Some people are saying you don't need it. Personally, I think every little bit helps, and if it avoids cow losses, I'm prepared to do it.
Nitrogen, I just quickly looked there. Sure, it's coming probably last year. The difference at about 300 a cow, or
well, last year's not really. It's a bit of a problem. Like last year, you were 1,000 a ton for nitrogen, right?
Exactly.
And everybody went crazy looking about Clover. But just remember back, it's a patience game, and we're not in this for a high nitrogen price year and then jump out of it the next year. It's actually to see, can we build a system. The point we're looking at, or the view we're taking of it, is not really, okay, there should be cost savings in terms of nitrogen, but it's more about building a system that, if we are not allowed to spread that level of nitrogen of what we have been doing, that we can actually say, well, that's fine. We can maintain our level of profitability. Is what the way I would look at it now. Again, I'd be accused of being a pessimist, but I would look at it, can you build a system where you can maintain your profitability even if the amount of nitrogen we're allowed to spread reduces? So it's kind of building in a bit of resilience into the system to what might be coming down the track in terms of, regulation. That's the way I look at it. If the cost saving comes, brilliant, but there are some complications comes with it too. And if I take a percentage, James, of the groups that come in to talk to us, we say there's 10 farmers in the group. There's probably one person is mad into this, right? And then there's 2 or 3 are dipping their toe, and then the rest of them are sitting on the fence. And I think that's where we're at. Like, I know in this neck of the woods anyway, that's where we're at in terms of Clover. There is farmers who, for whatever reason, they're just saying, right, look, we'll let this sit and we'll see how it goes for a period of time.
But I think you answered that question spot on, in the fact that it's really about developing a system where we can function, maintain, as you say, maintain economic performance, maintain animal performance, on reduced levels of chemical in. And as you say, there'll be some years where there'll be bigger cost savings than others. And really, that, look at, if we took last year, you would say it's a no-brainer. If you take maybe the second half of this year and fertilizer prices falling, that there's the difference is going to narrow. I think that's a good place to leave it, Donal. Look, thanks a million for all your questions, folks, and thanks to Donal, as always, very thorough. I think there was an open day last year, Donal, where you had record numbers. So there's a project ongoing in Ballyhaise that I think is applicable to all dairy farmers around the country, and no doubt there'll probably be another open day possibly next year where lots of people will be we'll be interested to see if you've maintained that level of clover in the swards.
We could be at 2% at that stage.
So look, thanks a million for your time, Donal, and thanks to all the listeners for your questions. Thank you. Bye-bye.